This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, there is a lot of debate about how to make sure Pittsburgh is a livable city for everyone, that longtime residents can still afford to live here, and that people do not get priced out. The debate is set to play out in front of the City Planning Commission this year because they are considering two different bills with two different visions for creating more affordable housing here in the city. Today, I'm with a reporter to talk about these dueling proposals and how the city might approach housing in 2025. It's Tuesday, January 14th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Julia Berdelski is a staff writer for Trib Live, and we're going to talk about the problem that city leaders say they are trying to address. Julia, how bad is the housing situation here in Pittsburgh right now?
I think the one thing that all city leaders can actually agree on is that we need a lot more housing in the city of Pittsburgh. We often look back to the housing needs assessment that was conducted a few years ago, and it showed that we had a huge gap between the demand for housing, particularly affordable housing, and the supply that was actually available. One of the statistics that people often cite is that for the low-income residents who are making no more than 30% of the area median income, which comes out to about $21,000 for an individual or about $40,000 a year for a family of 8. They're saying that people in that price range had a gap of about 8,000 housing units in the city between the need and the supply. So I think everyone agrees that we are thousands of housing units short, particularly for low-income residents who have a hard time finding affordable housing.
I mean, I'm just trying to do the math on that, $40,000 for a family of 8. That's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
It is. And that's kind of the lowest income bracket that a lot of officials say we really need to focus on providing more housing for those people because they can't swing it to afford to live in a market rate unit on that kind of income.
Yeah. So part of the conversation to do something about all of this, last fall, Mayor Ed Gainey comes out with this big plan for creating more affordable housing. Give us the broad strokes of his vision for this.
So Mayor Gainey wants to expand what is called inclusionary zoning, and that currently exists in a couple of city neighborhoods like Lawrenceville and Polish Hill. Mm-hmm. And what inclusionary zoning does is it mandates that any new housing development or major redevelopment includes a portion of those housing units designated as affordable housing for low-income folks in the city.
And by major, I think I read that it's if it includes more than 20 units or more.
20 units or more, exactly. Yeah. So any medium to big size, I guess, development would be included in this. So what the mayor is proposing is expanding that citywide. So not just in specific neighborhoods, but anywhere in the city. If a developer wanted to build 20 or more housing units or redevelop 20 or more housing units, they would have to designate 10% of them as affordable housing for people who make no more than half of the area median income. And that comes out to about $35,400 a year for an individual or about $67,800 a year for a family of 8.
So that really jumps up the threshold. I feel like we talk about that a lot. What should the threshold be for folks who need help? What is the ceiling? That's a
big part of the debate.
Yeah, it's strange to hear folks that are not under that ceiling talk about it in public for the last few months.
Right, absolutely. And there's so much debate as to where the ceiling is, who really needs the most help, who can and cannot afford to live in market rate units that are priced at the developer's whims. That's a big part of the debate.
Yeah. And then so under Gainey's plan, it would also need to stay this way for a really long time, 99 years?
99 years, yes. 99 years. His proposal also has a couple other little tweaks that aren't strictly inclusionary zoning, but I think are just worth mentioning. For example, he reduces the minimum lot size, so you could build housing on smaller parcels that currently can't be used for housing. So there are a couple different elements to it that are trying to encourage the building of more housing and specifically more affordable housing.
Yeah, and we've talked about some of those on this show. Like you could also like do like a granny flat, like the little apartment outbuilding kind of thing. It changes parking requirements, which has been a big holdup for folks. So Gainey introduces this bill. It has to go in front of the City Planning Commission and City Council. But then someone else comes forward with this different approach to inclusionary zoning. So tell us about the rival bill from City Councilor Bob Sharland. He represents the South Side.
Yes. So Councilman Bob Sharland came in with, we'll call it the dueling IZ bill. His is a little bit more complicated. Rather than expanding inclusionary zoning citywide, he is proposing that every neighborhood should get to choose for itself whether it wants to be included in inclusionary zoning or not. He hasn't quite specified how that process would work, but it would leave it up to individual neighborhoods.
And I still can't figure out how in the world they would go about letting a neighborhood decide for itself. Like, is that just for whoever can and is willing to show up to a community meeting? Like, do they send out a survey? Like, do development groups or community organizations get bigger votes? Like, there's a lot of questions in letting people decide on a neighborhood to neighborhood basis.
When I hear that, I think a lot of like the neighborhood planning process. Like Oakland just had a neighborhood planning process that was very contentious. Again, like Charland's bill does not specify how the process would work, but I think that one likely path would be that it would kind of be similar to that, where you have folks from city planning come in. If there is a registered community organization, maybe they come in, and then, trying to kind of gather consensus among residents and, business owners and other stakeholders. But then, of course, you get into the arguments that some neighborhoods have multiple RCOs, some have none. Some people feel that business owners and other people who are invested in the neighborhood but don't live there shouldn't have a voice. Other people say that they should. Like, it's really hard it's really hard to strike a good balance of making sure that everybody is equally represented. And, as I think you kind of alluded to, part of it also comes down to like who shows up to the community meetings, who cares enough that they want their voice to be heard, who is in tune enough with what's going on that they know.
Are they providing childcare? Is the meeting happening on a bus line? Like, is it happening during working hours? Like, there's a lot of things that affect who can show up to that stuff and who can't.
And who is even aware that it's happening,
True. How did they advertise it? How did they get the word out? Did they want to get the word out?
That tends to be a big criticism, right? Sometimes it's like this registered community organization tells their members and their friends, and then maybe they're trying to get the word out, but some people say like, hey, you completely excluded this portion of the neighborhood or this demographic. You did it all on social media and older residents didn't see that. There are just so many different factors to consider. And it's, without Charland's bill laying out a process, it's really hard to know what that would look like, because you could go a couple different ways.
Do you think it's possible that they could do it as like a local voter referendum? So like put it on a ballot, but then like tally up the responses based on ward or something like that?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
I'll save that one for Bob.
I have never heard like precedent for doing something like that, but that's not to say that it's not possible. I really don't know. That's a great question. In a way that almost feels like that would be maybe like the fairest way to do it.
I mean, but then it opens the door for like, who's going to be advertising for it? Like, who's going to lobby the public on behalf of it? Will the
How is it going to be worded in the referendum?
I know. Like, who decides all that?
His bill also includes kind of a tiered system where you could have developments choosing different price points to target with their inclusionary zoning. So, for example, you could have the same as Gainey's, where you designate 10% of your housing units affordable for people making no more than half of the area median income. Or you could do 15% of housing units for people making between 15% and 81% of the area median income. Or you could jump up to designating 20% of your housing units for people making up to the area median income.
That is so complicated. Like, I'm trying to follow. I need a chart and a graph and an easel.
Yeah. And he has a carve out where you could decide to opt out of inclusionary zoning in exchange for a fee that you pay to the city. So there's kind of a workaround for developers who really don't want to do it at all. His bill also has a shorter term of affordability. He's only proposing to require units stay affordable for 35 years. And I think the biggest change really between Charlin's bill and Gainey's bill is Gainey proposes that the developers have to pay for inclusionary zoning. Charlin is proposing that the city subsidize all of the affordable units and the city pay the developers the difference in what they would make, whether they were using that as subsidized affordable housing or market rate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious how that differs from the voucher program that exists already through the Urban Redevelopment Authority. Like they already have something like that kind of subsidizes rents.
So the voucher program is kind of separate. There are project-based vouchers where they will subsidize rents for specific units. And then there are vouchers which people could take anywhere to subsidize their units. The difference here is that Charland is proposing to pay for all of the units without you having to go through any kind of competitive process to get a LIHTC tax deal or a voucher through the URA. It would just be by right, the city is going to pay you whatever that difference is for all of the units.
That's an idea, but like, where do we get the money for that? Today's show is sponsored by the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens and a new award-winning tour of their historic home, Clayton. It's called Gilded, Not Golden, and it's a new spin on the old Frick family stories. Yes, you're going to learn about the mansion in Pittsburgh's historic Millionaire's Row. But this tour is not about oohing and eyeing over the possessions of a man who really famously, really notoriously, played a very big role in the Homestead riots and the birth of the entire American labor movement. It gives you more than that, the complexities of the man, his wealth, and exactly where it came from. If you've taken a Clayton tour before, it's time to return, so docents can take you back to 1892, the year of the riots, the year someone tried to kill Henry Clay Frick, and the year he lost 2 of his own children. Plus more on his corporate legacy, wealth inequality, and Frick's lasting impact on our shared environment. History is complicated, and that's what the Frick wants to share with you. The Frick's new signature tour of Clayton, Gilded, Not Golden, opens for the season on January 16th. Get your tickets and learn more at thefrickpittsburgh.org. So Bob Charland, like we said, is a city councilor. How are his fellow council members and residents, responding to not just his bill, but also Gainey's? Like, what's the conversation like? What's the tea?
It's a very mixed bag. Some people look at Gainey's and say that this is exactly what we need to do to incentivize more affordable housing because every development's going to have affordable housing all throughout the city. And some people are really excited about that. Other people look at Gainey's and say you need something closer to what Charland has, where you are providing the finances to bridge the gap so that developers aren't deterred from building. Because some people worry that inclusionary zoning without that financial assistance is just going to push developers out of the city and into the suburbs and have them not want to build here at all. So there's a lot of debate. Some people are questioning, as we kind of mentioned earlier, what threshold of income level we should be targeting with inclusionary zoning. Obviously, everybody agrees that, we need more affordable housing for low-income people, but, Bob Charland is saying that we need more housing for people making up to the area median income, making, kind of the average salary. And other people are saying, no, those people should be able to afford market rate units, and we should be targeting only the poorest of the city's residents. So there is kind of a whole broad spectrum of perspectives on this. And the debate has had so many different elements in terms of, whether we agree that the government should be paying for this, whether we agree to the income levels, whether we agree to bring this out citywide or use kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw Barb Warwick. She's a city councilor that represents Squirrel Hill and other neighborhoods around there. She called Charlotte's bill a political stunt.
Yes, she did.
I love it when the councilors start infighting just a little bit. It's a spicy comment from Barb.
It was. And I think her thought there was, seemingly Bob Charland is trying to ensure that Gainey's bill can't be approved because there is competing legislation on the table. So it kind of holds up the whole process. And, whether that's his intention or not, I'll leave that to him to clarify. But, because there are these competing bills, it makes it much harder to push either one across the finish line, because you kind of have to figure out which one you're going to support, where the two could be reconciled. It's hard for council and the planning commission to be kind of put in that position of having two opposing bills that do two totally different things, because obviously they can't both go into effect.
Yeah, but theoretically in service of the same thing. And we should say, too, like, council is not a monolith in any way. Anthony Coghill, who covers some South Hills districts, he opposes Gainey's bill. So is he in favor of Charland's? Because I saw him say something about, like, he doesn't want inclusionary zoning forced on his district, which I got to say is not a good look. I know that's just like an isolated comment, but it reads a little weird to me.
So Councilman Coghill has said that he is not supportive of mandatory inclusionary zoning everywhere. He has suggested being more supportive of the model of letting neighborhoods choose. I have not heard him come out against inclusionary zoning where it exists, but his contention is that some of his constituents and some of the neighborhoods he represents have voiced concerns about inclusionary zoning. He represents neighborhoods that don't see as much development as some other parts of the city, Brookline, Beachview, Carrick, where there aren't a lot of large-scale developments happening here anyway. And so I think his concern is that
it might deter the ones that would come, maybe.
Especially if the government isn't going to subsidize it, right? If the developers have to pick up that additional cost.
Gotcha.
He's afraid that it's just going to scare everyone off.
Well, of course, so now city planning, the commission has to consider both of them. Do we know how, like, that's going to happen? Like, what those conversations looked like? Because I don't think I remember at least where two competing bills were moving through the process at the same pace. Like, do they talk about them at the same time? Do they do one then the other? Like, how's it work?
That is a little bit unclear, actually. So both of the bills are currently waiting for the planning commission to take them up. And the planning commission will eventually take a vote and then send them back to city council. But I don't want to get too technical here, but the two bills actually are coming at the same problem from two different areas legislatively. So one is looking to amend a different part of the zoning code than the other. So they're handling inclusionary zoning. They're both kind of in the same topic, but they don't actually write over each other legislatively. So there's a little bit of confusion from officials as to whether they would be considered competing bills that could not be on the table at the same time. And I haven't actually heard a solution to that problem yet in terms of whether they will consider them to be competing in a way that bars them from looking at both at the same time.
Fascinating. So, I mean, is it possible then that, like, both could get approved technically?
In terms of what legally could happen, I'm not
like,
sure.
In effect,
but
I don't think that's possible, right?
Right,
Like,
exactly.
If one
In
rule
effect,
is the case, then the other one can't be. But, like, it's interesting that you're saying, like, it's approaching it from two different places. I mean, I guess in a perfect world, council would just reconsider and maybe pick the best of both bills and move that forward. Is that possible? Can we get along?
That is hypothetically possible if we can all reach some kind of agreement. I talked to Jake Pollock, who is the head of the Office of Management and Budget for Mayor Gainey's administration, and I asked him about potential compromise. And, he said that he didn't see a lot of places where there could be substantial compromise. Maybe there's kind of a middle ground that would be able to win support, because as they stand now, in effect, you could not implement both. They oppose each other.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just in terms of, like, personalities, like, is council, like, able to, like, come together with Gainey and, like, get things done right now? Like, what's the vibe at City Hall?
That is a good question. Some council members are still very friendly with the Gainey administration. Councilman Charland, who sponsored the opposing bill, is certainly not friendly with the Gainey administration, and they don't generally have a very strong communication or strong collaboration between the two of them. So that's hard to say. There were a couple of council members who kind of mentioned that perhaps some kind of compromise or amendment of one or both bills would be the best route, but it would probably require some other voices besides just Gainey and Charland in the room to help maybe moderate that conversation.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, not that I expect any of our listeners to have done this, but like having tuned into a handful of city council meetings lately, I it doesn't seem like they're on the best of terms, and maybe they're like buds off camera, but like at least in the room, they seem like they got a lot to say to each other on occasion.
Absolutely. Councilman Charland was very critical of the mayor when he first introduced the zoning package because he said that there wasn't proper communication with council to kind of give them a heads up that this was even coming down the line.
Yeah.
So
that was before like the whole kerfuffle with the city police chief, which it still hasn't been filled, and the budget fight, which is settled now, but I'm sure will crop back up at some point in 2025. I guess as you like step back from all of this, like what is any of this, I guess, signal to you about the city's kind of evolving approach to housing and especially affordable housing here in the city of Pittsburgh?
Absolutely. So I think that just the fact that they're talking about it and emphasizing it is honestly, it's a step in the right direction for getting more housing, even if we're all fighting about it and nobody's in agreement. At least there are, real efforts to do something about this problem that we hear people talking about and we've heard people talking about for years. At least they're trying to do something.
We argue because we care. Are there any other zoning reform efforts that you'll be watching for this year?
There are actually a lot of zoning reform efforts that we're keeping an eye on. One of the pieces of Gainey's inclusionary zoning bill is an allowance for what he calls interim communities. And this got a lot of attention a while ago when it was first introduced by Councilman Anthony Coghill and Councilwoman Deb Gross as kind of the tiny houses where they could build tiny houses, or they could also kind of renovate existing buildings into temporary homeless shelters and transitional housing.
Because Coghill built his own tiny house with like a window box and a door. It was very cute, but seemed like kind of impractical.
It was very cute, just as a prototype. But, it has worked in other cities. There have actually been a lot of other cities that maybe they don't all have their own cute little window boxes, but they do have, kind of the tiny homes, or they have renovated old hotels or apartment buildings into transitional housing. So it's worked elsewhere. But, when that had first come up, Gainey had voiced some opposition. So he kind of reworked it and included that in his larger zoning bill. Mm-hmm. But then Coghill and Gross came back and they reintroduced it separately as well. So that's also kind of halted before the Planning Commission right now, but in the works. And then separately, the Gainey administration has also introduced what they are calling the Fair Housing Amendments, which are another package of zoning bills. And a lot of it is just kind of reworking some definitions in the zoning code and things like that. Some of it feels a little bit tedious, I think, to the everyday person, but the portion of that has gotten some attention is a portion where he is proposing to change the definition of a personal care home to encompass homeless shelters and transitional shelters and allow those by right. So they could be built anywhere that other housing could be built. And on the flip side of that, Councilwoman Teresa Kale-Smith, who represents the West End, she has introduced a completely opposing bill. So we again see dueling zoning reforms, where she is actually proposing to add some additional public process and additional steps that would elongate the process for personal care homes as they now exist in city code. So, shelters or homes for people with disabilities who live in that community setting and things like that would be affected. And that has also been fairly contentious. And again, both of those are paused in front of the Planning Commission right now.
Yeah. And I mean, we had a guest here recently that pointed out that like all of this is going to be playing out in the midst of an election cycle because the primary is in May and Gainey is being challenged. So, I mean, our guest said that like he was kind of skeptical that anything controversial might get passed, at least between now and May and the result of that Democratic primary.
I think that that's quite likely. I think that the fact that there is a contested Democratic primary coming up is making a lot of these tense relationships more tense and kind of exacerbating the problems that we're seeing in City Hall in terms of getting people to work together. And I think that for folks who believe that Corey O'Connor is going to win, there's a desire to kind of wait and see what he would want to do and what he would want to implement. Certainly if he does win the May primary, I think that will kind of strengthen that case for, wait, there's a new mayor coming in. Let's wait and see what he wants to do. So I think that it's probably going to be a while before we see resolution on any of these zoning bills.
Well, we'll keep watching what you do, Julia. Thank you so much. Julia Brodowski is a staff writer for Trib Live. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. The Planning Commission is expected to discuss both of these proposals in a meeting today. They're also having another meeting on January 28th where they get into both with more depth and possibly a vote. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news and more about inclusionary zoning, including one Pittsburgh neighborhood where residents say it has worked really, really well. Talk to you soon.
It's hard, though, with something like zoning because the details are normally like where
it's hard with the news.
It is. But like specifically something so technical like this, if we just like oversimplify it, then like Charlotte's bill and Gainey's bill actually sound kind of similar because they are both inclusionaries. Like you have to kind of get into a little bit of the nitty gritty to figure out what's different.